The Maine Senate voted today to sustain Governor Mills's veto of a bill that would have changed the state's right to repair laws. 24 senators voted to sustain the governor's veto, while 10 voted to override it. The state Senate's vote comes a week after the Maine House of Representatives voted to override the veto. The bill would have put into law a set of unanimous recommendations from the Automotive Right to Repair Working Group to clarify and improve the effectiveness of the law after it was approved by Maine voters in 2023. Mills said she supports the recommendations, but noted the bill includes a provision that would allow automobile manufacturers to decide how vehicle telemetric data would be accessible to independent automotive repair shops. The governor said access to vehicle telemetric data is essential to diagnosing and repairing modern automobiles.